Coming up in our next installment of America's Hope, counterterrorism expert Walid Phares talks to me about Iran's involvement in Hamas and the fact that Iran is sponsoring other terrorist organizations to wipe out Israel. That's our next focus on America's Hope. Good evening, I'm Kelly Wright, and this is America's Hope. We welcome you to tonight's program as we focus on the Israel-Hamas war and the fallout that's being felt here in America, and also the nexus of terror as it relates to the country of Iran. Tonight we'll have a special guest on to talk to us about that. Counterterrorism expert Walid Phares joins us, and then later in our program we'll hear from Katrina Lantos Swett of the Lantos Foundation. Both will weigh in on the all-important issue of not only the Israel war, but also the rise in fallout and protests on our college campuses, and even from members of government. All that and more coming up tonight. Let's get started. Oh, my first guest is Walid Phares. He is a world-renowned terrorism and Middle East expert. Now, Walid has testified before the State Department, European Parliament, and UN Security Council, and so many other places of importance. Walid has a new book out now. It's called Iran, an Imperialistic Republic, and U.S. Policy Explains the Regime's Influence over America. Walid, good of you to join us today. It's good to have you on the program, my friend.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
You know, you and I have covered a lot in the past as it relates to terrorism. What's happening with Israel is no exception to the fact that this was an attack, a surprise attack on October 7th, committed by Hamas, a known terrorist organization. I guess my first question is about this is, what are the main messages of your book and how it relates to what we're seeing unfold in Israel?
Well, unfortunately, my book came at a time of two developments, one after the other. It kind of projected them. I don't want to say predicted them. One was over the past 9 months, the Iran revolution that was taking place inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the second one was the rise of the pro-Iran militias in the region, starting from Iran itself to Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and obviously what I call the southern tail, which is Hamas, located in Gaza. The first message was really for the readers, for the American public, to understand that there is a regional network of terror organizations, all linked up to the Iran regime for many, many years. Unfortunately, Kelly, our educational system, the academic system, did not really inform and educate the American public, those students who really later will become the graduate students who will go to newsrooms, to war rooms, to courtrooms. So there was a systemic failure that I've seen here in Middle Eastern studies in teaching the American public as to the nature of what we're seeing. I mean, obviously, you and I in the past have discussed the other jihadi organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, others, Qaeda, Daesh, but that specific network that links Hamas to the Iran regime is something that most Americans were not really familiar with. Message number two is basically to the civil societies in the region who have been for many years trying to get rid of these radicals and extremists. We discussed a long time ago the Arab Spring, how it started in one place and then it was diverted into another place. But more importantly now, the message of the book is for the American public to understand that our foreign policy, the United States foreign policy, unfortunately, at times, depending mostly from 2009 till 17 and then last 3 years, regardless of our politics, have not been successful in stopping the Iranian regime and stopping these organizations. And now the result is that they are on steroids. And the attack that you mentioned, which was a shock to the world on October 7, was not even a normal jihadi attack. It was a genocidal the goal, the individual goal of every jihadi fighter, terrorists, knowing that jihadists, kill civilians around the world in the West and in the region. But this one was an actual systematic killing of children and torture and women and elderly. That is something that we have witnessed for the first time. And my book prepares public opinion to understand.
Walid, that's a lot that you just talked about, and all of it aiming to the fact that Iran is behind this brutal surprise attack, which became Israel's 9/11. Let's unpack what you were talking about just a little bit there, because it really shows a nexus and a lexus of terror operating within the Middle East. As you and I have discussed before, ISIS did not go away. Al-Qaeda has not gone away. They all have the tendency to morph into something more sinister, more deadly, and certainly, as you've just pointed out, that's what we saw on October 7th. The response, however, that Israel has conducted with its terrorist attack and its counterattack on Hamas, people have protested against that. And you were talking just a moment ago about the graduate students and the education, and how we had some systemic failures in educating the masses about the real threat here. Is that why we're seeing on college campuses so many people who are pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian, and Walid, even a city council in a city in California denouncing Israel, saying that Israel is committing ethnic cleansing?
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to overwhelm your viewers, but you and I had so many discussions. I mean, we are witnesses to history. We're talking about 18 years of, engaging and watching what was happening, in terms of the morphing of jihadi organizations. Now, let's look at 2 points to answer your complex question. Number one, yes, the Iran regime is the mothership of at least one large branch of these terrorists. You have 2 branches, one which comes from the Sunni environment, but is extreme and actually against the Sunni moderates. That's the Muslim Brotherhood, Daesh, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. And the other one that we're dealing with now is the one influenced by Shia radicals who are in control of Iran. But here's what is unique about Hamas. Number one, it is made of members who are Sunni. But number two, it is funded by a Shia radical organization network that is controlled by Iran. So this is the ultimate, I would almost call it by terrorists. It's like bipartisan here. They have by terrorists. Imagine when Al-Qaeda and ISIS and then Hezbollah on the other side merge into something new. That's what we're dealing with. You raised a question that is way more important than any discussion till now, since the operation, which is what is happening here at home. I mean, our public, some reactions on some circles within our, the American people, raises questions. Why would it be that thousands of citizens, U.S. citizens, we're assuming, and maybe residents, have been adopting the lexicon of Hamas? I mean, in the past, those who were anti-Israel, we understand there are people who are pro-Israel and people who are anti-Israel. But what we see right now is that we have seen out of these campuses in an entire generation that considers Israel as illegitimate. But not just that the actions of the jihadists in Israel are legitimate. And it's also true not just for Israel, but for the Kurds and for the Arab Sunni moderates, for the Christian minorities. So there is a systemic problem, which I try to explain when we engage in the discussion, and you just saw it clearly. There is a problem in our campuses, and that problem is the fact that there is an elite which since the end of the 90s has been providing, I would call it now clearly, disinformation and misinformation and radicalization of an entire generation, more or less. Now, the more dangerous question, and I can discuss it with you as well, where is it coming from? Where does the origin or the funding for these new Middle East studies or radical Middle East studies coming from? Now the public can understand that when we send money to Iran, when we send those billions of dollars, what do you think the Iran regime do with this money? Well, they earmark it for weapons, for militias, but one slice comes back as donations from foundations and NGOs, and with it comes the message. So the Iranian regime was involved in the radicalization that is leading and that led to what we have seen now on the streets and on campuses.
What can the United States, its Western allies, its allies within the Israeli community, what can they do to stop this type of disastrous situation?
Well, Kelly, first let's try to take a look at the Iran plan, meaning the regime. When I say Iran, I mean definitely the regime. The plan was, number one, first goal, to stop what was going to happen, which was a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel to seal the deal of the Abraham Accords.
Absolutely.
And that would have isolated the regime, that would have done tremendous things in the region and, of course, worldwide. So over a couple of years, especially since the withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan, that's another factor. It encouraged them. It put them in a position of they are on steroids now. So they prepared Hamas, they prepared Hezbollah in the north of Israel for an operation that would at least delay, paralyze, or break down the Israeli-Saudi rapprochement. That's by itself would be a catastrophe if it happens. But there is a second reason, which is internal to Iran. The revolution that I mentioned to you, which we have witnessed for many, many months, by young people, by women, by minorities inside Iran was very close from actually changing the direction of the country, changing that regime, and starting a new Iran, which would have ended Hezbollah, ended Hamas, ended all of these radicals. The regime, Khamenei and the Pasdaran and the Quds Force who control Iran, they feared that the international community in the United States, maybe not this administration, but another administration or Congress, would fund and support the revolution. So to redirect attention, I call it the mega decoy. Decoy is when you try to divert attention. And that diversion of attention was in the form of a huge terror attack against Israel. And the real goal, is once Hamas, strikes with that barbarity, Israel cannot but counterstrike. And when Israel counterstrike, that's what they wanted. So they provoked it to be hit by the Israelis and then run around with their troops around the world and mobilize, as you just mentioned, and say, oh, they're killing our civilians. But the first chapter of that play was done precisely to bring Israel into war and to break all kind of relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, between Israel and Europe, the clash between this administration and Israel. They have very, very smart intelligence strategists, I can tell you that.
Yeah, let's not forget that they created the game of chess, and they have applied it in a very brutal way in this current climate that we're living in. I'm talking to terrorism expert Walid Phares. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more of Walid in just a moment. Welcome back to America's Hope. I'm talking to Walid Phares. He is a counterterrorism expert, and he's written a book about Iran, and he knows all things as it pertains to Iran. And Walid, we were just talking about how Iran's strategy has worked so far by creating a lot of, I hate to say it like this, but creating a lot of distraction, if you will, to the United States, its Western allies, and people taking their eyes of what really unfolded in Israel. So Israel is left with one choice, and that is to defend itself because they have the right to exist. Yet we know that Iran wants to obliterate and destroy Israel's right to exist. Can you explain for us and for our audience why Iran has that kind of philosophy and angst towards Israel?
Well, it is actually an ideology which was victorious in 1979 with the first, what they call the Iranian Islamic Revolution of Khomeini. In fact, it was a coup because there was a revolt against the previous regime. Many movements, wanted reforms. They succeeded in the change of government in Iran. But then that force, I call them now the Khomeinists, because of Khomeini's, it's like the Leninists, he destroyed and killed and massacred his own partners in the opposition. So to begin with, Kelly, it was a coup. It's not an Islamic revolution, it's an Islamist coup that killed and eliminated everybody else. The goal was to establish an Islamic regime, which is like a Khmer Rouge type of totalitarian regime. And they were not just interested in setting it up like for Iran only. They wanted Iraq, they got Iraq. They wanted Syria, they have now an alliance with Bashar al-Assad of Syria. And they set up an organization in Lebanon, a militia to control Lebanon, in Yemen and beyond. Their view is worldwide, and they paint the outside world as follow. Israel is the small Satan, the United States is the greater Satan, and everything in between in Europe or elsewhere are infidels that they should subdue and defeat. They are not so different from the jihadists, the Salafists of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the rest. Now, why do they use the Palestinian issue and Gaza in particular against Israel? Because that would send a strong message, emotional message in the entire Arab Muslim world. But there is a response to that. Since you've asked in the beginning of the question, what could be the response? The response is Israel will have to do what any country that has been aggressed is to go after the aggressors. Even this administration knows that, the European knows that, and discreetly most of the Arab countries, they know somebody has done something horrific in Gaza and there need to be measures. But obviously the fact that we are pressuring them, our administration is pressuring them, because now we find ourselves in a very difficult situation. We have units and we have a presence across the Middle East, and now we realize that Iran will attack Americans. So we are establishing this dome of protection, and we are asking the Israelis, give us some time so we can protect ourselves. The Israelis have no time. One of the ideas circulating right now is that the Israelis will take care of the heavy weapons of Hamas and dismantling that organization. But after that, some other countries need to play their role and responsibility. Remember the Abraham Accord, right?
Right.
So Israel has partners, we have partners. They need to come in. They need to change the educational system inside Gaza. It should be Arabs who will actually de-radicalize or at least end the era of the jihadists in Gaza. How? I don't know. It's too far to be clear for us right now.
And I want to get to your other point. You talked about Iran's goal is to defeat the great Satan, which would be the United States. To do that, they have to have partnership. The partnership would be with other adversaries. So where does the nexus of the adversaries coming in to help Iran fall into place? Is that Russia? Is it China? Is it North Korea? Is it Syria?
This is yet another epically strategic question. So let's divide it into. You have what the Iranians consider as partners, strategic partners, and that would be obviously Russia. There is a partnership between, this government in Russia and the Iranian regime, and they are on military cooperation and all what comes with it. It's against Russian culture, because Russian culture does not want an Islamist regime to be the winner, because that would affect part of Russia. But with this government in Russia, Mr. Putin's government, they are in a situation, especially after they entered Ukraine, where they need the Iran regime. And that's how Iran took advantage of that. And they are receiving the technology they want from it. But the other partner is easier for them. It's China. They have signed an agreement, I think last year and early last year, strategic agreement for 20 years at least, whereby China will buy as much as it wants from gas and oil from Iran, and in return, it will provide Iran with all the weapons it needs, and even naval units of the Chinese will be stationed across the coast of along the coast of Iran. So these are two very large partners. Behind them, you have North Korea, and suspicion is that North Korea may transfer some of the technologies of the nuclear weapons. If not, and I may dare say this, maybe transfer a nuclear weapon to Iran with all the cash that the Iranians are receiving. So that's one set of international players and associates of this regime. But there is another set which is smaller size, and the aim of that set is, as I said earlier, the control of multiple countries in the Middle East. But then, Kelly, is to place cells and networks in the belly of the dragon, since we are the dragon for them. What they have been doing for years now, I mean, certainly months, but for years, is to bring in cells inside the United States or to radicalize inside the United States. And same could be said about Europe. And we are inviting them just by, stopping any defenses on our southern borders.
Yes.
I don't need to be an expert on our southern borders. It's an absolute desert that Iran and Al-Qaeda and everybody can cross. And certainly Iran has been infiltrating and penetrating for years. So I am very concerned about what they have for us inside our country, not just what they're doing in Gaza or in Lebanon.
So, Walid, that's a very sobering thought about what's happening along our southern border, and certainly it's been that way for many years, especially since this new administration came into play. The former president of the United States, Donald Trump, was actually making sure that he could stop the threat by strengthening the southern border. The current president, Joe Biden, has actually allowed so many people to come across, and of course we hear about gotaways. Do we understand how severe this threat is, not only to Israel, but to the free world?
That's another drama on a historical level, because I observed the last decade and a half. When you speak with national security experts or analysts, as you know, also I've briefed many agencies for many, many years on all sorts of levels, especially counterterrorism, but also special operations and radicalization. So the bottom line is this. We witnessed a change of policy between 2009 and 2017. These are the two terms of President Obama. And during those two terms, that's almost a decade, 8 years, many things have been changed in the national security doctrine of the United States, which in fact reconstructed our doctrine by priorities that had nothing to do with Iran. Actually, with Iran, the national security doctrine was about to partner with them, find common ground, which is the Iran deal. And the Iran deal by itself, in the book explained in details, is a transaction. I mean, in popular talk, I would say the Iranian regime fooled us. It's a transaction for which we send $150 billion. It's Iranian money, granted, but it's not the regime's money. This money should be released when there is a change in Iran. You don't send it to the regime that is fighting us. So what they've done with the money, most of it, and again now from 2021 till now, this offshoot or this extension of the previous policy under this administration are doing the same. But are doing it in a stubborn way, relentlessly sending money to Iran's regime. And what they do, everybody knows now. They are purchasing weapons. So what we're going to encounter them, those who are shelling us in Syria and Iraq and maybe in other places in the Middle East, that money, those ammunitions were purchased by the money we send them. I have never seen any case in history that would resemble this. And that brings me to the conclusion that short of a massive change or rechange in foreign policy in Washington, I don't know when this is going to happen. We barely have now a new speaker. It's only 1 year before the next elections. So if we don't have a massive change in foreign policy and national security under this administration, which I don't know if we're going to be able to do it, or the next administration, Iran is winning and their allies are winning. And Israel is going to get more and more strikes like these. And so are going to be Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan, our other allies.
Based on all that you've studied and based on your book, do you leave any room for a hope for America and Israel?
For America, hope is still here. It's a great nation. It has still all the resources that nobody else has. That's in terms of potential, we have them. What we need now is that, as you just said exactly, that the American public, which has instincts at the end of the day, they trust their government to a certain limit, and then they make up their own opinion, and then they have to transfer that opinion to their elected officials. And there is a chance, even this year, there is a chance that the administration, under pressure by Congress, will start changing on all levels. First of all, I can see some signs that this administration realize, or some officials at least realize, what's happening on the southern border. If we lose our border, all foreign policy is irrelevant. So first you have to, it's like immediate emergency medical treatment for the southern border. Second, obviously we have the resources in the Middle East to, first of all, start to partnering, obviously with Israel, there's no question about that, but with the Iranian opposition, with the Lebanese civil society, with the Kurds, with our normal allies, traditional allies in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. We can form again that coalition and isolate the bad guys, should it be the Iran regime or the jihadists. That is possible. But at this point in time, it needs pressure by public opinion on Congress on the administration. And that's in the interest of the administration. I'm not political at all, but if they want a better chance for next year when people are going to be, comparing notes, they need to do those changes now, because what we see in the region right now will be even worse by next year, and they will become responsible, at least morally and politically. So there is a chance for the Israelis. They have never shied from doing whatever they can to defend themselves. It would be much better if that defense would include the United States, would include the Europeans, and of course the Arab moderates. That will increase their chances of survival.
So very important. It's so good of you to join us. I appreciate all the things that you've been reporting on and talking about. Just appreciate your insights and your information. And really, I hope it inspires people to step up and do the things that are necessary to not only protect this country, but our allies, and of course our strongest ally in the Middle East, and that's Israel. Walid Phares, do me a favor, don't be a stranger, come back as often as you can to keep us enlightened and informed.
Thank you so much for having me, and I encourage everybody to get my book, and if one day they'll see me at some events, I'll be happy to sign.
And coming up next on America's Hope, I'll be talking to Katrina Lantos Swett of the Lantos Foundation. We'll hear her comments about what's unfolding in Israel. So I'm honored to bring on, she is Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett. She serves as president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, established in 2008 to continue the legacy of her father, the late and great Congressman Tom Lantos. And under her leadership, the Lantos Foundation has rapidly become a distinguished and respected voice on key human rights issues and concerns. And Dr. Lantos is the former chair and vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. She joins us now to weigh in on the matter. It's good to have you on, Katrina. I hope you don't mind me calling you that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
It's indeed my honor and my pleasure as well. You know, we are seeing some very precarious times going on in the Middle East as it relates to Israel. This is something that you know quite a bit about. And at first, I want to start with your first reaction to what you see happening in the Holy Land.
Well, obviously, what is happening now in the Holy Land was precipitated by the unimaginable horror that was visited upon Israel on 10/7. But I think we need to see these events in a broader context. This really is a civilizational struggle. It's a civilizational struggle between good and evil, between the forces of democracy and human rights versus the forces of terror, brutality, and authoritarianism.
You know, your father experienced what took place in World War II as a Holocaust survivor. As you were growing up, what kind of stories do you recall hearing your father discuss and your mother before they fled from Hungary to get here to the United States to start their new life?
Well, both of them shared with us the way they became hunted animals in their own country. Both of my parents, both Holocaust survivors, were bright, talented, patriotic young Hungarians until they were caught up in the sheer hatred and horror of the Holocaust. And as I say, became hunted animals in their own country. They saw the degree to which former neighbors and friends and business partners became enemies, willing to turn them in and betray them to in some cases, a fate worse than death. But they also saw some incredibly powerful lights that shone in the darkness. Both of my parents were ultimately saved in different ways by the great Swedish humanitarian Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat from neutral Sweden who left the safety and security of his life there to come to Hungary at the height of the Hungarian Holocaust with one mission, and that was to try and rescue as many innocent Jewish lives as possible. And my mother tells me that they called him their Moses from the north, and that light really did shine in the darkness. And so I think both my sister and I really learned from my parents two lessons, two sides of the coin: the depths of depravity, which human beings are capable of inflicting on each other, and the heights of humanity to which they can rise.
And so when you see what's happening and unfolding in Israel today, and the turmoil that they're having with Hamas, and then the vitriol that we're seeing on college campuses in America and throughout the world, where pro-Palestinians and pro-Hamas are basically supporting Hamas. I understand the plight of the Palestinian people and the fact that they're caught up in this, but let's not forget that Hamas is the ruling party and really the occupying force in the Gaza. So to that end, when you have an enemy that's vowed to take you out because of your Jewish faith, what does that say to you as someone who grew up in a home of Holocaust survivors who were able to go out and champion the rights of freedom for everyone?
Well, your question is profound and so beautifully phrased. I would say a few things. First of all, I would say that, as Winston Churchill so memorably said, when you are going through hell, keep going. Hell has come to Israel, and genocide and absolute destruction is what Hamas has promised to bring. And so I think we have to, in a clear-eyed way, understand that Israel has no choice but to eliminate Hamas. And if you think back again to the Second World War, both Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt agreed on a policy of unconditional surrender. They knew that in dealing with the embodiment of evil, which was the Nazi regime, you couldn't look for an armistice or a ceasefire or an effort just to stop the fighting, as much as everybody would love to see that happen. There had to be the utter destruction of the Nazi regime. And one of the lessons of history is that what was able to be built out of that utter destruction of the Nazi regime was modern Germany, modern Japan, democratic allies, strong supporters of the rule of law, of democracy, of human rights. You speak about the Palestinian people, and they are surely also victims of Hamas. And that is something that I think we also need to keep in mind in a very clear-eyed way, that whenever war takes place, of course, there will be dark and tragic days for all sides. And I mourn, all people of goodwill mourn the terrible things that innocent Palestinians will have to endure. But it is being brought upon them by the murderous hand of Hamas. And I want to just underscore how important it is not to engage in the really deceitful, sort of game of trying to establish moral equivalence. In Israel, their fighters interpose themselves between the danger and the innocent civilians. They put their lives on the line to protect the innocent. In Gaza, the Palestinians force their innocence to be unwilling human shields. Israel uses its fighters to defend the innocent. Hamas uses the innocent to defend their murderous fighters. There is no moral equivalence. And the Palestinian victims are victims of Hamas.
So important for you to point that out, because a lot of people have forgotten that, including some members of Congress. What would be your message to members of Congress who perhaps have looked at history through a skewed lens, and perhaps they don't really know all the history of what led up to World War II and the Nazis, bearing in mind now that the President of the United States, who traveled to Israel, told the Israeli people, as well as Bibi Netanyahu, the Israel Prime Minister, that he compared Hamas to being like ISIS. And then, of course, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, going on to say that Hamas is the equivalent of Nazis. So from that perspective, what would you say to those members of Congress and others on college campuses, professors and academia, who have supported the notion that Israel in some way, somehow, is being racist and genocidal?
Well, first, as you suggested, I really want to commend President Biden. His response, I think, has been strong. It has been unequivocal. And what matters a great deal to me, I used to work for Joe Biden. He was my first boss out of law
Oh,
school.
wow.
So
I didn't know
there's
that.
a personal affection and connection there. But it's very clear to me that his response, which has been so strong, has come from the heart. And I think that matters a lot. He is not simply sort of saying words of solidarity as talking points, but from the heart. But as it relates to the thousands of college students, to the handful of members of Congress, their efforts to excuse, to contextualize, to justify the atrocities committed by Hamas will redound to their shame for the rest of their lives. It will redound to their everlasting shame. They will never be able to live down the shame of having attempted to equivocate or justify or excuse a level of savagery and brutality that has shocked even some of the most hardened war correspondents, military fighters, anti-terror specialists in the world. Um, it it shows to me that they have utterly lost their moral compass, utterly lost their moral compass, and and I have nothing but contempt for them. But I don't underestimate them. And that is why it is so important, why I'm so grateful to you that I have the opportunity to be on this program. We who see the shamefulness of what they are saying and doing, we must speak out boldly and unafraid. I saw a very interesting article written by sort of a very liberal, left leaning, progressive, woke, if you will, uh, individual, Jewish individual, who has described his own shock and horror and dismay at the way those he thought of as allies have reacted with cavalier dismissal at the death, the intentional murder of his own people, his own cousins, if you will, in Israel. And he has sort of said, I just woke up and recognized I've been in an abusive relationship and I'm getting out.
I'm talking to Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett. She serves as the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. We're going to take a break. When we return, we'll talk to her about what her organization is doing in Washington this week and why that, too, is very important and significant to what's going on as it relates to the Israel-Hamas war. Back with more of America's Hope in just a moment. Welcome back to America's Hope. I'm talking to Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett. She serves as the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. You know, I saw you give a speech once and you stated and you quoted, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons and daughters of God." Making peace is not always an easy task. In many cases, Katrina, we're finding that making peace and thereby trying to keep the peace can be extremely arduous, painful, and dangerous. Talk to me about how you see peacemaking in this process.
Well, I think it's the dream of all of us, isn't it? But I think at this time and in a moment like this, we have to distinguish or be able to distinguish between the moral duty each of us has individually to be peacemakers and to seek peace in our communities, within our families, and in the world, as distinct from the duty of political leaders who have the responsibility to confront evil. When we seek to make peace with evil, we use a different word for it. We call it appeasement. And appeasement never ends well. We can remember before the outbreak of the Second World War, when the British Prime Minister at that time, Neville Chamberlain, went to Munich seeking peace. His intentions were good and came back waving a piece of paper, peace in our time. But of course, his appeasement uh, emboldened Hitler. And it was not too much later that Britain was at war and the whole world was at war. And so, again, the duty of policymakers, of government leaders, is to confront evil, not to appease it. The duty of each of us individually is to work for peace, is to conduct ourselves in such a way that we can build bridges, even with those with whom we disagree. But it must be on the foundation of mutual respect, respect for the rule of law, respect for fundamental human rights. And we simply can never build a lasting peace or any kind of a peace, any kind of a justice through appeasement of those who seek destruction, murder, genocide, annihilation. They have to be defeated, and then peace can be built.
Katrina, thank you for that. As you stated to me during the break, there is no middle ground between good and evil.
Yep. Yep.
And that's well said. And I'll end it with this. You've been working a champion of human rights, and of course we always hold out hope that we can take out bad people, evil people, and get them to a place where we can actually perform a more perfect union. I've got to ask you, what's your hope for America and Israel during these troubling times?
Another wonderful question. You ask the best questions. Well, first of all, my hope and prayer is for strength, for resoluteness, that they will be valiant and that we will be valiant in this very difficult and dark time. My hope is for the comfort and the courage that comes from knowing that you are engaged in a worthy cause and a righteous battle. And specifically for our country, for the United States of America, which I love so dearly. And like I'm sure most of your viewers, it's been painful for me to see the divisions that have arisen in our society. Yeah. I hope that the gravity, the severity, the seriousness of this moment will cause us to put aside our petty differences, to find again our common ground around the values that lie at the heart of this country. Respect and honoring of the rights of all individuals, defending human rights and democracy, and standing shoulder to shoulder with those who seek to do the same in their part of the world. So I hope we may come out of this a stronger and more united nation.
I ditto to that. I agree with you 100%. Katrina, thank you so much for joining us this hour. Appreciate you so much.
Thank you. It's been a privilege to be with you, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you. We're back with more in just a moment. And welcome back to America's Hope. I'd like to thank our guests who appeared on tonight's program, Katrina Lantos Swett and Walid Phares. Certainly we have gleaned from them a sober assessment of what's unfolding in Israel and how it relates to the United States and, for that matter, the entire world. So my final word is this. When you hear experts talk about what's unfolding in an historic battle like that between Israel and Hamas, we would do ourselves a favor in taking heed to their knowledge, their wisdom, and their understanding. If we fail to do so, we may find ourselves on the wrong end of history. It's time for America to take a stand for what is good and denouncing what is evil. It's just that basic. Lives are at stake on all sides of the spectrum, but more importantly, freedom is at stake. And what we have heard tonight really shows us that freedom is not free, and freedom, at all costs, must be guarded. Don't let go of hope, America. Keep hope prevailing and enduring. Until next time, God bless. Your America and my America.
United we stand, divided